Hello viewers, Tim Poole here, editor of Gambling Insider, and I'm with
Will Underwood, writer at Gambling Insider.
Today we're going to be reviewing SiGMA Malta. You may have seen on our socials on Gambling Insider that we were at the show. We were interviewing a few different people. We're going to review 2024 in our words. We're going to talk about the main takeaway points from that show and our interviews, and we're also going to make some predictions of our own about 2025 in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it was just really nice to, aside from getting out of the cold London air, it was really nice to go and reconnect with all these people that you see from all over the industry, you know, often through a screen. It's nice to see people in person.
Absolutely, and when you meet people in person, you get little stories that you might not otherwise. So, for example, Araxi Sargsyan from Head of Business Development at DS Virtual Gaming, she was talking about an operator that was talking about virtual players being louder than the average player, and she openly said, "We're not denying it. Virtual players are louder," and it's just very interesting to think of that kind of aspect when you're making a deal.
Mm-hmm. And we also interviewed two Champions League winners, AC Milan, I believe in 07, Massimo Ambrosini and Serginho. Fascinating to talk to them about a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Really, they were there with Boomerang partners, I believe.
Absolutely, and Milan is a key word when it comes to SiGMA because next year this show moves to Milan. So one thing we did with a lot of interviews was review 2024, and we asked them their year in 3 words. So I think it's only fair if we start by maybe giving our own 3 words. Maybe we take turns. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, my first one is, well, I mean, I suppose it's actually 2 words, but RG, responsible gambling. I feel like that's been a big theme, you know, a growing theme over the last 10, 15 years, but really this year, a big one. And it seems that there is a enhanced focus on it, and people finding out their roots into it, I feel like has been something that I've found really interesting this year. Kind of leads me nicely onto my second word, which was advertising, which I feel has been a big sort of theme in terms of regulation in Europe this year. And that sort of ties in with the whole responsible gambling sphere, I feel. And something that I felt was interesting, and I would expect to see sort of as an extension of that maybe over the next couple of years in the US and North American market would be self-exclusion. And yeah, those are my first 2. And my final one was personalisation. Ties in with the whole technological sort of theme that we're going to explore a little bit later on in our chat. Yeah, it's been a year of personalisation in iGaming for me, I've sort of found. So yeah, what about you, Tim?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree on those points, and I think it's fair to say, as we're reviewing kind of the SiGMA Malta show, these were themes that were quite prevalent kind of throughout the show as well, and people would have been talking about them all week. Personalisation, I definitely agree. I'm going to go to one of my words, retention, because there's a bit of overlap there. We've always talked about this being kind of, there's often a race for acquisition, bonuses, free spins. When it comes to retention, I think the iGaming industry, online gaming, would freely admit that there's not enough focus on retention, certainly in the past. But I think this year we're seeing at least a small shift towards it. There's a lot of, as you say, personalization, gamification, loyalty, reward, this kind of thing. So I think retention was a key word this year. It's always important, but I think the industry is, especially with acquisition costs, really understanding the importance of it. I'd say anticipation is another word as well. We're going to talk about Brazil later. Everyone is talking about Brazil, but there's a lot of anticipation for markets, mainly Brazil. But in terms of new regulation, changing regulation, even in the UK, there was a bit of anticipation with the rules that might come in. Taxes weren't raised, but maybe they will be at some stage. So I think we're in that stage with some key markets where there's a lot of kind of, anticipation. That's why I picked that word. And then final word for me would be dominance, and related to the US, because FanDuel particularly dominating that market. DraftKings obviously a big share, BetMGM and Caesars a little less, and a couple of others, Bet365 as well. But beyond that, unlike European markets or markets around the world where you could reel off 20, 30 names of top operators that have big market share, there really was a lot of dominance among a small kind of amount of operators in the US, and that's not necessarily a negative. It creates new kind of characteristics for the market, new challenges, but I think that's obviously a theme we can't really deny at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. And so moving on to sort of our key reflections maybe from SiGMA. The first one that I would be interested to point out was discussing AI technologies, we spoke to Vitaly Anisin from Alpha Affiliates, who said something interesting because I'd say, the vast majority of people who you would speak to in the industry at the moment, and indeed the vast majority of people who we interviewed about the subject of AI in Malta, obviously, said that it was maybe the biggest revelation of 2024. Certainly the biggest technological development that's affecting, the gaming industry right now. But from the affiliate side, Anisin sort of seemed to believe that it wasn't actually as much of a revelation as people were sort of suggesting at the moment. At least for Alpha Affiliates, it hadn't really seemed to become this big thing that everybody is talking about right now for them. So I thought that was quite interesting. It's probably the first time I'd heard that said. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice point because, as you say, when you talk about hot topics with a number of people, it's nice to hear different opinions. And AI, I'm personally not sure where we are on the scale of how far we have used AI to its great potential. Will it take over the world, etc., etc. But yeah, definitely an interesting point. I think my first takeaway point would be I want to talk about microbetting because Dinos, COO of Altenar, I put him a question about bet builders, and I personally love bet builders just as a player using them. But he made a good point that if you put on a bet builder, usually if it's a football match, it's 90 minutes. Other sports will vary, and you have to wait a long time to see if that one little factor that you're waiting for, whether it's goal kicks or fouls or yellow cards, comes in. Whereas microbetting is next ace in tennis, next goal in football, and not even next goal, could be next throw in. It could be really specific. And I think he's right. That's where the industry is going. But it's a very interesting point because for me, obviously, not just for me. You mentioned RG earlier. There's a lot of RG considerations if someone can suddenly bet a lot more in a quicker space of time. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. I think the industry needs to manage it in a way that regulators and regulation will catch up with it later. But if the industry can be sustainable and to a degree self-regulate, it can be a huge success and in the right way.
Yeah, I think, the second point that I wanted to sort of point out was speaking to Arcangelo Lanoche, head of business development from Habanero. Generally all round fascinating conversation. But really, really interesting to talk about game development and AI from the game development side. And from the supplier side, obviously, it has been a big thing. It ties back nicely actually into one of my words, personalisation, which AI has made a big difference when it comes to customer acquisition and retention. And from the development side, Arcangelo pointed out that it has been very useful. However, he also kind of pointed out that from the customer side, it's something that you wouldn't necessarily notice at all. And that generally, actually, from a wider gambling sphere, as big as it has been, it's also not extremely noticeable in terms of the actual gameplay experience, which is just another point and another take on a really, really interesting and obviously big sort of development in the industry this year that I hadn't necessarily heard pointed out before. So.
Yeah, and he made a nice comparison to Blur and Song 2 as well.
He did, indeed. Yeah, game development being similar to songwriting, which is a really, really interesting analogy.
Yeah, my next point was going to be, I guess, looking at a sector, Crash Games, and we spoke to David, the CEO of Spribe. Really pleased to have him on, and it was just interesting. He was talking about the numbers, the kind of market share they had. I believe he said 90% market share for Aviator, but just a fascinating trend. Crash Games, I think it's growing. Whether it will outgrow traditional slots, probably people have told us it's probably not. It's more of a little bit more of a niche offering in comparison, but it's amazing that it has so many millions of players. Obviously I've tried the game. It's fascinating in terms of there's a social element because there's chat and there's leaderboards, but the player has control. You can cash out rather than the random number generator kind of element. So a takeaway point for me is just which I will also mention again later, and similar to microbetting, the kind of faster nature of gaming and how that has really grown this year and will continue next year.
I suppose now that we've sort of looked back over not only SiGMA but 2024 in general, it's probably a good time for us to put forward our predictions for next year, really.
Absolutely. I think it's fair because we've been asking people to do the same.
Yeah.
And I will actually say as well, just on the while crash games are fresh in my head. We obviously, you mentioned our magazine on personalisation earlier.
Yes.
We had a cover feature on crash games earlier as well this year. But I'll kick off with my prediction if that's cool. And really it ties in with the points I've made into, again, micro betting and crash games, and the industry is getting faster. People want. I don't want to say attention spans are getting shorter, like that's a bad thing, but it is something that's happening. People want things now, and there's a lot of competition out there. You know, when you're sitting on the sofa or on the train, whatever you're doing, you can watch something on Netflix. You can play any number of mobile games and online gaming, and you know, gambling, you know, in the right jurisdiction with the right license, is just competing with all these different forms of entertainment. So, in terms of prediction, I'd say the industry will keep getting faster. Maybe the kind of slower, longer forms of gaming will face more competition. But what this potentially creates is, you know, as I said earlier, the responsible gambling considerations. Regulators will have to keep up. There will be challenges. And like I said earlier, it can be a huge new area, micro betting and things like that. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's got to be done the right way because regulations evolved, responsible gambling is evolved. So hopefully that makes sense as a kind of prediction.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about responsible gambling as part of your prediction because it's sort of part of one of mine as well, something I mentioned earlier about self-exclusion. I really do believe that in the next couple of years, we've seen, and already we are starting to see it with Ontario's self-exclusion list. I think in the North American market, we're seeing more of a focus on that side of RG, whereas what we're seeing a lot of in the European market is advertising restrictions, which that's sort of a general prediction for me over the next couple of years, but more in focus, I want to talk about Brazil, because everybody does. My prediction is that it's going to be inherently difficult to predict what's going to happen. I mean, looking back on what's already happened, it's been a bit of an incredible journey really through 2024 on their road to regulation. I mean, I think halfway through the year, most of us believed that they weren't really going to be able to get their ordinances released on time by July. They did, and now it's all kind of flipped back into disarray again. I think that the public perception of gambling is kind of on the floor at the moment. It's the same in government as well. I think that Lula is perhaps looking a little bit, I wouldn't say regretful, but you know, perhaps concerned about the perception and the way that the market might be received once it's opened. And I think that there's a lot going on in the courts as well, clearly between the difference between federal licenses, state licenses, there's a lot of contention there. And I think once the market opens, there's going to have to be a lot of adaptability from the operators who want to operate within it. So yeah, I think it's going to be really, really interesting, but I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult than people maybe anticipate. However, I think it's also worth saying that those who get it right are going to have an opportunity to really, really thrive there. I think there's obviously, you know, a world of potential in that nation with regards to gambling. So yeah, it's going to be a very, very interesting one.
Thanks very much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
I had a lot of fun talking about it. For all our other videos, check out our LinkedIn page and our YouTube as well. We've got plenty of interviews from the show. And yeah, it was great to be at SiGMA with you, and we'll look forward to our next show as well.